Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Beyond the Breakers, a podcast about shipwrecks, loss, and lessons learned from maritime disasters. My name is Tanner, and I'll be one of your hosts today, and I'm joined, as usual, by Taylor. Taylor, how's it going?
Not too bad. Not too bad. It's a nice chilly Sunday morning. We moved back an hour, daylight savings time and everything. I think I went to bed at like 10 o'clock last night. So I woke up at like 5 this morning, just ready to go. So that was something. But other than that, not. It's good being on first shift now. What about you?
Doing pretty well. Weather-wise, we had our first snow here a couple days ago.
Gross.
Actually snowed quite a bit more than I expected to. Got a few inches of snow. And for some of my students, that is, if not their first snow, it's very a rare occurrence for them.
It's also like one thing to see snow versus seeing like inches of snow.
Yeah, I mean, because a lot of my students, right now, most of my students are from China, and China, kind of like the US, is a land of contrasts. And you have students from China who, they're very familiar with snow, the ones who are from up north, closer to Beijing, they've experienced snow and the cold before. But you've got some of my students from southern China, that's, I don't know if it technically is, but it's basically a tropical environment, and they've never experienced snow or really even been uncomfortably cold in their life. So yeah, it's an interesting contrast with the students and their excitement for it. I remember when we had our group of Panamanian students a couple of years ago, the night that we got our first snow, I think it was probably like late November, and it started snowing at like 2 a.m. And so they had all run outside to play in the snow in the middle of the night because they were so excited, because don't exactly get snow in Panama. It's always a fun time of year here in Wisconsin with our international students, because it is just kind of a different experience for them. Getting to experience fall in Wisconsin is really beautiful. The leaves changing, the weather getting colder, them having to sort of figure out what kind of clothing they need. We had 5 or 6 pairs of gloves, like extra, just sitting around. So I brought those in, and those went quickly. I like that part of my job, because it's more than just the language aspect. It's like acclimating them to life in the US at university. So there's a lot more aspects than just grammar, vocabulary. It's kind of the whole life adjustment also.
And for some of the students going back to Panama or, southern China, might be the only time they ever see snow. You never know. This could be like a once in a lifetime experience.
I will point out at the beginning here. So this episode we're doing, this is our first book club episode we're recording. So typically these are going to be released on the bonus feed at the $5 tier, at the second mate tier.
For the discerning Patreon member.
First one, kind of like what Taylor did with the first Naughty Yachties episode. We'll release this one on the main feed to give you an idea of, I don't know, what kind of stuff we'll talk about when we talk about books. And then we'll close those off and keep those secluded for the elect in our later releases here. So today we will be talking about Jack London's The Sea Wolf. We announced, I guess, about a month ago at this point. Try to do that in the future and give you a month or so to read along with us, and then we'll do something to discuss it. Whether that's a recorded episode like this, maybe we'll get into having some more live roundtable type discussions. We can get some guests on. So we'll see what we want to do with these in the future. But, hey, as long as you're reading something, that's what we care about. But yeah, speaking of reading, what have you been up to media-wise?
I've actually done quite a bit of reading. I finished Masters of the Air by Donald L. Miller. I mean this in the best possible way, but it is a very dark book. This book may have done the best job for me as far as just showing you that, no one had a good time in World War II. Absolutely no one is enjoying what's going on here. They talk a lot about the psychological part of the bomber crews and how they could be bombing Berlin at lunchtime, and then they're back home at base having a steak and a beer at dinner, and how some guys just can't do that forever. They talk about, just the stress that goes into that. But then they also talk about the impact that it had on German civilians and the terror raids and things like that. And it's just really interesting hearing those discussions in 1943, 44, because they're the same things we talk about now.
Well, if the Germans didn't want to get bombed in their houses, they should have voted the Nazis out of office.
That's actually definitely some of the some of the people felt that way.
They should have risen up against the Nazis and taken control of their country, I think. Otherwise, they're just as complicit as the Nazis, I would say.
It's interesting because you are dealing with like technological limitations of like what was considered a precision strike at the time, where like civilian casualties are going to happen, but like legitimately unavoidable, versus later on in the war when they're trying to end the war. And it's very much like, no, this is the purpose. We are bombing just the city, which actually the British really spearheaded that operation. I didn't realize that there was such a divide between American bombing and British bombing.
Just like spelling, there's big differences in how we do it. I do want to point out, I realize that not everyone listening to this episode will be listening to it at the time it's released. So my comment about German civilians deserving to be bombed is made facetiously as a commentary on the discourse surrounding the deaths of Palestinian civilians due to their failure to eject Hamas from the Gaza Strip. I'm putting the, what is it people do on Twitter? Like the /S post here to show that I'm being sarcastic. And I do not believe in the blanket killing of civilians based on what their government has done.
Yeah. And I mean, honestly, that is like a lot of the ethics discussion in the book. I mean, you've got someone like LeMay, bombs away LeMay, who literally wants to just drop all the bombs. And then you have people like Jimmy Doolittle, who's like, well, I'm still a military officer. Like, I'm here to kill the enemy. And like, that's what I want to do. Like, yeah, I understand there may be civilian casualties and that's tragic, but like, I don't want to cause more than I need to. So it's just very interesting, the debates that are going on behind the scenes. Overall, it's really well written, ton of emphasis on the human side of things. They spend a lot of time talking about the POWs and everything and how that changes, that early on in the war, they're treated pretty well. As the terror bombings increase, all of a sudden, you better hope that the SS finds you, because they're the only way you're going to not get killed by a civilian. So it's very interesting, like what's going on in all that. I highly recommend that book if you're interested in World War II. It's a lot better than just like dogfight stories and things like that. There's just a lot going on. Because I enjoyed that so much, I started another book by Donald L. Miller, City of the Century, the Epic of Chicago and the Making of America. So basically just looks at how Chicago came to be, which, I mean, we talk about Chicago so much on the podcast. I mean, you can't tell the story of Chicago without it being transportation, right? I mean, that's why it exists as that link between the Mississippi River system and the Great Lakes and the East Coast. So right now it's very early on, learning a lot, just with the initial stuff with like Joliet and people like that and Marquette. So it's just interesting. And, there's so many of those names on streets you see in Chicago and Milwaukee and all these towns. And
have you learned who Whacker is yet?
No, we don't know who Mr. Whacker is yet. Sure, he'll come up. It's just interesting how much the dynamic, how different it was with the French versus like once American people start settling further west. The French, obviously not in the best, like it's still like colonialism, I suppose, but like it's a much more symbiotic relationship with the natives versus like all they want to do is make them Catholic. After that, the natives can do whatever they want to do. I
mean, I've always heard about that kind of in the sense of exerting soft power.
It was just settled so differently. Yeah. It's interesting that when that first wave of people from the East come to Chicago, I've never seen the word half-breed printed in like newspaper clippings so much that he takes it from. But like they look down on all these like French, basically Creoles that like were a mashup of like French and Indian culture. It's very interesting. Like, you don't ever hear about that in like the history of Chicago. So I thought that was very interesting. So yeah, that's what I've been doing. What about you?
I've been reading just more of the Bridget No-Gun-Ree on massacre of civilians during the Korean War.
We only read the happiest books.
Yeah, I mean, I've just been very much in a nonfiction sort of, not rut, but kind of very much just focused on nonfiction recently. It's a lot harder for me to like get the wheels turning on fiction once I've been out of it for a while. I am reading actually another Jack London book. I'm reading Martin Eden right now.
I struggle with getting into fiction too, because I think Master and Margarita was the last fiction work I read before Seawolf.
Yeah, it's just like there's so much. I feel like reading nonfiction for me, it tends to spin off into other things more quickly and easily. It's like I read one thing, it's like, oh, I've got to read this other related thing. And so it always just seems like there's so much of that to read that now, if I sit down with like a fantasy novel, unless I'm in like the exact right mood for it, I'm just like not as invested in it.
Mm-hmm.
It's also easier for me to multitask if I'm reading nonfiction.
Yeah.
So, I can have a baseball or, football or basketball game on and kind of be glancing between that and jump back into the something nonfiction. Whereas like a novel, it's like you've got conversations you got to keep track of. You've got all this like, internal action. It's harder for me to jump in and out with fiction. So yeah, I've been reading a lot more of that. I've also been finally actually pushing forward in Robert Fisk's Pity the Nation about Lebanon. I had mentioned that on a media check-in, like, I don't know, probably like a year ago. And I never actually like read it. I had started it, but didn't really pursue it. And then now I figured it's a good time, what with, what's happening right now with Israel and Gaza, the West Bank, and, Lebanon obviously being heavily involved in that as well. So kind of pushing forward in that. At this point, I'm in kind of the early 80s. So with Israel, invading Lebanon to basically make a buffer so that Palestinian militias and Lebanese militias can't hit Israel with rockets.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think Hezbollah is technically on the scene yet, but they're coming. I think that's really what I've been getting up to.
It's a very book-heavy episode.
It is. I'm really excited for this episode because usually when we talk about books, it has to be kind of squeezed into the first 5 or 6 minutes of the show. But we're just spending the whole episode talking about a book today.
Just to balance out all the book-ishness, I remembered one other media thing. WWE Crown Jewel was yesterday, and that was a lot of fun in Saudi Arabia. It was actually fun. It was a really good pay-per-view. And as much as sometimes WWE struggles to give us a compelling story, they at least entertained me for 3 hours yesterday. So I'll give them that.
Was the fact that it was in Saudi Arabia like a plot element?
No, more just like the Saudis have that sweet, sweet oil money that they want to give to Vince McMahon and friends. But that also means that wrestling comes on at 1 p.m. in the afternoon. So that's a little different.
Vince McMahon and the Saudis is kind of like axis of evil. Vince McMahon is still alive?
Yeah.
Is he active?
Less so now. They're slowly taking control away from him, I believe. I
did listen to probably one of my favorite series on Behind the Bastards was the one on Vince McMahon.
Yeah, the one where Robert says it just kept going. That was really good. And you kind of understand why he's the way he is, probably. All
right. So we can get into our series. Again, we're kind of figuring out how we want to do this, but I don't totally want to do it like we do with our movie episodes, how we'll go kind of every plot detail. We'll just kind of discuss it, I don't know, like you would discuss a book in your high school English class.
Yeah, I think more themes and things like that is what we're going for here.
Yeah, like what does the green light on the dock symbolize? So we read the book The Seawolf by Jack London.
I've never actually read any Jack London. I only know of White Fang and things like that from the movies.
This was my first novel of his that I read.
I'm sure I read something of his in school at some point, a short story.
The Seawolf was published in 1904. You get a good glimpse at society of the early 20th century as presented by Jack London.
I think it's a really interesting time period because you're in that transition time between kind of steam power versus, what came before that. It's just a very interesting time to be around. I guess it's probably just before pre-Gilded Age, beginning of the Gilded Age.
I would say it's kind of the middle, maybe late Gilded Age. I think of the 1890s when I think of the Gilded Age.
Yeah, I guess that is.
This is I guess that period between that and the Jazz Age and Prohibition and stuff like that.
The quick Wikipedia says 77 to 1900 is the Gilded Age. So, okay, so this is post Gilded Age.
Well, yeah, and in many ways, that's one of the interesting things about the book is the setting and kind of being able to read it retrospectively from so much later. Really, a lot of the themes, I did a good bit of reading, some of the research that's gone into, Jack London on, from literary scholars. It's interesting because Jack London, as we'll talk about more later, he identified and was identified as a socialist. And at the time, early 1900s, obviously that's a fairly radical stance to have, but it is mainstreamed in a way that it isn't now. It's
really interesting how I don't think everything had been decided yet almost in what is and isn't allowed to have discourse around it. So all of these ideas, there's just so many unique ideas that would be surprising to us now that there was real debate around them.
Well, and I guess with socialism is an example of one that kind of was presented as an idea among equals and then went through a long winter of suppression in the United States where it was absolutely not cool to identify with socialist values. And now you do see a reemergence where it is acceptable to identify that way and actually make some sort of progress in politics. I mean, you've got national level politicians, the Squad being the most visible, but it's something that more and more, with DSA, not that I think DSA is a perfect organization, but the fact that it's a mainstream thing that is less and less shocking to hear someone identify as. But then also, talking about ideas like Jack London's views on race.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot more eugenics in this book than I expected.
But then also how much that is tied in with his socialist thought.
There are some really weird combinations of things that don't fall neatly into our modern left-right paradigm that we're in. There's just a lot more stuff mixed together. It's pretty wild.
So the Sea Wolf, right away, it ties into one of our stories. I think this is what actually made me read The Sea Wolf, was one of the stories that you presented. What was the name of that ship? It was one with a San or Santa name.
I want to say it was I want to say San Pedro, but that is not the answer. I'm searching for it now.
We did the San Pedro de Alcantara, but that was the one from South America. San Rafael.
That's it. San Rafael, episode 68.
So the San Rafael was a steamboat that sank in San Francisco Bay in 1901. And in the opening pages of The Sea Wolf, if you've listened to that episode, you see almost the exact same story, kind of a shot-for-shot depiction of what happened with the San Rafael.
Yeah, it really is. I was surprised because I know it said that it had sort of inspired the beginning, but I didn't realize he just took the newspaper clipping and embellished it, basically. Which is apparently something he did and kind of got called out for. He has a lot of plagiarism accusations. I didn't know that.
Plagiarizing a real world event?
Basically, and he fully admitted he just cut out newspaper clippings and add in elements to his stories and stuff.
So he's on this wreck. He ends up in the water, and he is picked up by who we find out to be the sealing ship Ghost, captained by Wolf Larsen. Our first exposure to Wolf Larsen, he's first see him as this just kind of one-dimensionally brutal character.
Mm-hmm. Like what you'd expect a sailboat captain to be like.
Our narrator is Humphrey Van Weyden, who is he's like a writer. He's like a literary critic.
Mm-hmm.
So he's definitely from the academic class.
Yeah, he's not a work with his hands kind of guy.
No. And so he gets picked up by the Ghost and Wolf Larsen, who are on their way to Japan. He's sort of dragooned into being a member of the crew.
Yeah, it's weird. It's like watching those videos when the guy's asking the cop, am I free to leave? Am I being detained? and he's like, basically, yes.
Because if I remember correctly, one of the crew has died or is dying when he gets picked up.
I think they had just lost someone.
And so he's sort of joined into the crew at the lowest possible level. He tries to bribe Wolf Larsen to go back to San Francisco, which of course Larsen refuses, which I think is an interesting characterization of Larsen at first. As we'll talk about, Larsen being kind of depicted as a force of nature. Of course, money doesn't work on him.
Right.
He's this cold and unfeeling character, at least at first. And so yeah, Van Weyden, he's an academic. He's not like you said, not a work with his hands guy. So it takes him a long time to really adjust. But in the process, he does a lot of thinking and reflection. There was a few quotes that I flagged throughout that I'll try to pepper in. And one of the quotes that stood out to me the very first time I read it was from chapter 4. And Van Weyden says, "Callous as they were to my suffering, they were equally callous to their own when anything befell them. And this was due, I believe, first to habit and second to the fact that they were less sensitively organized. I really believe that a finely organized, high-strung man would suffer twice and thrice as much as they from a like injury." So as Van Weyden is struggling to adjust and really having a bad time, he's finding things to admire in the men who are around him. things that he probably would not have admired in his previous life.
I can kind of apply that to me from making that transition from third shift to first shift. I worked third shift for like 10 years. Just seeing all the things you have to do to make that work and then suddenly not having to do them, you do realize, wow, they're all so miserable, but you have to be that miserable to do it, because if you sat there and thought about it, you wouldn't be able to function.
Yeah.
Like, you have to accept a certain level of uncomfortableness just to get through the day. And it's sort of the same thing here.
You could say the same with like finances, because like there's been times like with Katie and I, like when we had almost no money, you know, you've got to be, when you're standing in line at the grocery store, having to pull out your phone and make sure that there's enough in your bank account to buy your groceries. And like we haven't been in that kind of situation in a while, but like it sucked at the time, but it wasn't something that seemed impossible. And like now thinking back on it, it's like, man, how did we do that? So yeah, I think it's what you get used to, but also like there's a certain level of admiration you have for
someone in that situation.
Yeah, and like a ability to tolerate suffering to the point where we kind of fetishize it a little bit.
Absolutely.
I mean, you do see it with Palestinians right now. I'm not like trying to criticize how people post or what people post, but it's like you do see a lot of the idea of, you know, the Palestinians are so strong, and they are, and that's objectively true. And that kind of becomes the focus is, you know, having this almost otherworldly tolerance for pain and suffering. And, you know, as I think a lot of them would tell you, it's like, there's not really a choice.
I'd rather not, actually.
That's the situation that they're in right now, that they're being put in right now.
Mm-hmm.
You know, back to our story, Humphrey, in his suffering, he does manage to find admiration and kind of aspirations almost, hoping to be like them at some point.
Another thing that this process reminded me of a little bit is Platoon. Like the story in Platoon of sort of the same thing. You know, the main character there is a normal kid, like what didn't grow up like poor or anything. And like, he just wants to go be in it. And, you know, in this case, our main character's been thrust in it, but sort of the same thing of like, this is an alien world and like, I'm not supposed to be there. And you sort of have admiration for those guys that even though like in your previous life, you'd look down on them. Now that you're in that situation, you kind of admire them for what they do and like how they get through it.
You could say that about like any customer service job also.
Absolutely.
Like, it's not the kind of thing that, you know, has a lot of social cachet, but anyone who's done a job like that, you kind of develop a different set of values that you admire. So yeah, I think it's what we see here with Humphrey is he's reassessing what is valuable in life. So we see, we have a scene where Humphrey is in Wolf Larsen's cabin and he notices his books. He realizes that Wolf Larsen is a bit of a reader. And this leads to a lot of conversations, you know, what develops into philosophical conversations with Wolf Larsen and Humphrey, and then later Maud, which is obviously one of the kind of the big battlegrounds of the book. Is we see this sort of war of ideas between Humphrey and Wolf. It's in chapter 15 where we have, I think, one of the most interesting scenes in the book is, I forget the exact circumstance, but Wolf Larsen like is partially undressed. He has like his shirt off, and Humphrey says, "God made you well." Here, I'll just quote I'll quote from that chapter. "God made you well," I said. "Did he?" he answered. "I've often thought so myself and wondered why." "Purpose," I began. "Utility," he interrupted. "This body was made for use. These muscles were made to grip and tear and destroy living things that get between me and life. But have you thought of the other living things? They too have muscles of one kind and another, made to grip and tear and destroy. And when they come between me and life, I outgrip them, out-tear them, out-destroy them. Purpose does not explain that. Utility does." I like that quote as a sort of revelation of Wolf's thoughts about himself. He acknowledges that he is superior to other beings, but in that acknowledgement, he's also he's also basically pointing out that like there's no purpose to any of this. This is literally just about survival.
Mm-hmm.
I'm no better than an animal. I'm just doing this to survive. I just survive better than other animals. A super depressing worldview.
It really is. But also one that is like pretty easy to slip into sometimes almost. You know what I mean? Like I can see that line of thinking arising today where it's hard to have a lot of faith in, government or things like that it's pretty easy just to be like, well, there isn't a lot of purpose to this.
Throughout our discussion, I might find different pieces of this to pepper in, but one of the coolest articles I read in kind of researching for this was by Eric Carl Link, called The 5 Deaths of Wolf Larsen. And it details his 5 different sort of interpretations that do overlap, but his interpretations of Wolf Larsen losing out overall to Humphrey in this sort of battle throughout the book. And the first one he points out is death by Nietzsche. And Jack London's relationship with Nietzsche is interesting because, like, Jack London, because of his writing that tends to focus on, like, physical prowess and, raw survivalism, there's a tendency to sort of conflate his thinking with, kind of the Nietzschean Superman. And like Jack London wouldn't have seen it that way. There was an interesting quote from Jack London writing about Nietzsche. I have been more stimulated by Nietzsche than by any other writer in the world. At the same time, I have been an intellectual enemy to Nietzsche. Which I think is cool, and I think it's an insight into what reading sometimes should be.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, reading something that you don't necessarily agree with wholeheartedly is good because it helps you to articulate why. It helps you to articulate, well, what do you feel about this?
Right.
That's not to say that you should be reading Mein Kampf, but there's things you can read where you can sort of filter out. It's like, I see where the writer's coming from here, but I disagree for XYZ reason. And so, yeah, it's interesting to see that London's opinion there. And really, Larsen is intended as a critique of the Nietzschean Superman. His flaw really being that Wolf Larsen can't exist in his own, in the society that he inhabits. Like the time and place that he lives, Wolf Larsen is incapable of really integrating with.
I think it's like an interesting critique of something we see today, which is like a lot of the hustle and grind mindset and the stuff around a lot of the, I guess I would say, alt-right adjacent stuff where there's like an emphasis on fitness and not relying on anyone else, be a sheepdog, all these things. Like, you're different than everyone, you're a protector. Like, it's those kind of ideas. I just think it's very interesting that even at this time, I feel like Jack London would say that's stupid. Like, what? Why?
Selfishness dressed up as altruism.
Yes, 100% was of like, I'm different. I'm not like everyone else.
And like, not to say that in this case, I don't even think there's a veneer of altruism, but yeah, like with that idea of masculine alpha self-reliance that you see.
It's the person who likes Wolf Larsen unironically. It's the person who likes Fight Club and doesn't understand it.
Well, that was actually London's the problem that London had with people's response to Martin Eden, because like people read it and being like, "Oh, cool, this character's awesome," and he's like, "No, that's not what it's for. That's not the message of the book."
Yeah, I feel like sometimes people struggle, especially when it's a main character. Like Tony Montana's you're not supposed to like him.
Or yeah, like a more modern example
guy.
would be like Walter White. You're not supposed to be on Walter White's side.
It's very interesting. And I feel like it's the same thing here. Like Wolf Larsen is like a great example of that kind of character done really well. And that, like, I love the character, but he's not a good guy.
The point of the book is that that's not a road that leads ultimately to success.
Mm-hmm.
That leads to slowly having your own body kill you and going blind. But more on that, kind of the idea that no matter Wolf Larsen's physical prowess, his inability and really his unwillingness to coexist leads to, what is his premature death. London wrote, "The Superman is antisocial in his tendencies. And in these days of our complex society and sociology, he cannot be successful in his hostile aloofness.
I mean, this feels so modern. This feels like right now when talking about some of these same issues.
Yeah, London's views on society and what was needed in society and what was really inevitable in society from a natural worldview is interesting in the context of characters like this.
I mean, he might as well be talking about the guy that's got 10 AR-15s that he's bought and like stockpiling ammo. It's the same. That's what he's critiquing, I feel like, here, if we want to apply that to like modern day. Because that person is what, a Superman with those guns when no one else has one, right? I mean, physically, might makes right in that scenario, which I know they reference that in this book, which that's another Behind the Bastards discussion if someone wants to go back and listen to that.
Whereas maybe with our guy stockpiling guns might actually be more successful distributing those guns out to his community to ensure a wider community defense if he actually wanted to accomplish something.
Right. Instead, he wants to be the Superman who wants to save everyone until he doesn't, and then bad things happen.
Yeah, so Link writes about that. It is the death, referring to the death of Wolf Larsen, says it is the death of a loveless, antisocial Superman. You could kind of talk about it like diversifying your portfolio. Wolf Larsen has put so much into, his physical presence, and it's like when that fails him, once his body is revolting against him, he has these, I guess what are like super strong migraines.
Mm-hmm.
But once that goes away, he's left basically with nothing else to survive on because he's already burned all his social bridges. In that article, Link continues. His next section is called Death by God. In a few places, Larsen is compared directly to Satan, either by other characters or by Larsen himself. The character of Louis, I think it's the first time that Larsen's headaches are mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
He sort of diagnoses those as the hand of God striking down Wolf Larsen, and that if more punishment doesn't follow, then God isn't doing his job.
I think this is interesting here because it's sort of, I feel like, playing on the idea that for all intents and purposes, Larsen is God on that ship. I mean, he decides where they go. He decides when they eat. He decides who lives and dies in some scenarios. Like, this man is making all the decisions.
Which I think itself is kind of a parallel to Satan, to Lucifer. The idea that, this is if we're accepting the like cosmological existence of Satan, someone who would be very powerful and who would seem all powerful many situations, except for the fact that there is this more supreme being that could theoretically totally dispense with him, which I guess in Larsen's case is nature itself. So there's that idea of him being punished by God. In a few spots, Maud refers to Larsen directly as Lucifer. Larsen himself praises Lucifer as depicted in Milton's Paradise Lost. He says, this is Larsen speaking, he led a lost cause, and he was not afraid of God's thunderbolts. Hurled into hell, he was unbeaten. I guess a comment there. I think if you get hurled into hell, I think that means you got beaten, doesn't it?
Also, just like lost cause, anything not good.
We're not fans of lost causes.
No.
Stabs in the back, lost causes.
Just all bad.
Larsen continuing here. Lucifer was a free spirit. To serve was to suffocate. He preferred suffering and freedom to all the happiness of a comfortable servility. He was no figurehead. He stood on his own legs. He was an individual. Which I think is interesting, like thinking of the terrifying sea captain figure, you don't think about that character waxing poetically about individualism.
Mm-hmm.
You kind of think of him being like, well, no, everyone needs to get together in the group and do what you're told. And so it is kind of one of those like freedom for me, but not for thee situations.
Right.
Like I doubt Wolf Larsen wants his crew exhibiting individualism, but like as he does with Humphrey, he's basically making it a challenge. If you want to do that, you have to take it. You have to take it from me directly.
Mm-hmm.
No one's going to give it to you. If you wait for someone to give you your freedom, your individuality, then you are just going to be stuck, on the bottom rungs of society.
I think one other interesting thing I kind of thought about while you were reading those quotes is how differently it's shown with like Maud and Humphrey's understanding of some of these things from an educated background, a literary background, whereas Larsen's self-taught, and like sometimes his analysis is either flawed or in some ways better than theirs, just depending on the situation, because it's just like a pure self-taught thing rather than being kind of given what to think in an educational environment. Like it's just a very raw interpretation of everything that he reads, I feel like.
This reminds me of a TED talk that I use in class sometimes about creative thinking. It's by Giovanni Carrazza. I don't love most TED talks. I think a lot of them are vapid and stupid. But this one's cool because he talks about how to think creatively, and he talks about convergent versus divergent information, and he talks about direct and indirect experience. And you're talking about Wolf Larsen being self-taught. All these things he reads, he really only has the prism of his own experience to put them through.
Mm-hmm.
He hasn't taken classes on these. He hasn't probably read, literary analysis of these things. He only has his own experiences to bounce them off of. Whereas like Humphrey and Maud are more exposed to the wider discourse really around these writers and these ideas. So they can kind of see like, yeah, what do they think about it? But also what do other people think about it? So it's an interesting contrast in how we develop our personal ideas about something.
Mm-hmm.
After Larsen's praise of Lucifer, Maud somewhat derisively laughs Lucifer off as, quote, the first anarchist. And Larsen retorts, then it is good to be an anarchist. Again, not something you expect a sea captain to say.
Right.
So all of that is right before Larsen's attempted assault on Maud. I think that's like the page before.
I think so. It happens quickly.
And kind of like what I was saying, for most of the book, Larsen is made out to seem really all-powerful, especially in the first half of the book. But, like Lucifer is eventually defeated, or in this case, just kind of outlasted. He's not really directly defeated. Wait for Satan to go away, and like eventually he will.
He's just going to be really annoying about it.
Yeah, by the end with this, it's just like, shut up! Oh my god, just die! Speaking of just shut up and die, the third section is called Death by Darwin. So the third method of interpretation that Link has here is that of the evolutionary struggle. Larsen kind of gives us his evolutionary worldview early in the story. He says, the big eat the little that they may continue to move. The strong eat the weak that they may retain their strength. The lucky eat the most and move the longest. That is all.
I think that is like the best synopsis of how capitalism actually works.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I enjoyed that quote because the whole part about being lucky is the truest part. That like, no, there's plenty of idiots who are millionaires and billionaires. They got lucky. There's plenty of smart people who are poor. And like it's just the way it works.
Yeah, like the like how natural selection is described as the survival of the fittest, and that's like a natural phenomenon that happens. And like later, I have some notes about social Darwinism and how people take those ideas and apply them to society, which is like not what that's not the data set that theory sprang from. So yeah, this idea of capitalism, you talk to any of those grind set guys, any of your, venture capitalists, they'll tell you, oh, well, the one who takes the most risks, the one who, works the hardest, the one who, works the most hours, the most days, the one who's willing to put in the work is the one who will win out. Whereas you look at like, how much work does your average billionaire do in a given day?
Right. Exactly.
How did they get their seed money? What does it mean in survival of the fittest? There's a few factors that go into being fit, and not all of them are ability or, knowledge. A lot of them is luck.
Yeah. And I mean, that even goes into the animal. Like you can apply that to the animal world. You could be the biggest, strongest deer, but when there's a Kenworth coming down the highway and you're in the way of it, like it doesn't matter.
Link portrays this as a struggle between two organisms, Wolf Larsen and Humphrey, to adapt to the demands of their environment. Wolf obviously has sort of developed into the apex predator in his environment. No one on that ship is really going to challenge him before Humphrey's arrival.
Humphrey is an invasive species.
Basically, you could say that because, Humphrey arrives, and then later with the introduction of Maud, you can see it on a biological level as all these organisms needing to adapt to their environment and the changing factors in it.
Well, and especially in the sense that Maud sort of gives Humphrey a purpose beyond himself, so he no longer has to live the way that Larsen lives.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he's not just living for himself at that point. Like, he feels like a responsibility that Larsen doesn't feel other than to himself.
With Larsen's, attempted assault on Maud, he's sort of trying to make her fit into his world.
Mm-hmm.
And that obviously that fails. He's not able to do that. Whereas throughout the book, Humphrey is kind of the image of adaptation. He starts out totally different world. He ends up dropped onto this boat, and he's totally unfit for it at the beginning. But slowly, he builds up his physical strength. He builds up his cunning. He builds up his even just his combativeness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, his willingness to engage, like, in a hostile act if that's what the situation calls for.
Like with Mugridge, is that his name? The cook?
Yeah. The cook is like the grossest character in the story.
He is, and how he's kind of the first boss that Humphrey has to defeat.
Yeah, sort of establishing a hierarchy. It's like watching cats figure out who's in charge.
Yeah, because he gets on there and he's kind of lower than even the guy that everyone hates.
Mm-hmm.
But then he's slowly able to surmount that challenge. And after that, his opinion of Mugridge is really derisive.
Yeah, he's just kind of a pathetic creature.
He's not afraid of him anymore. I mean, in a way, he's similar to Gollum's character in that, like, in Lord of the Rings, like, at times Gollum does seem threatening, but then at times he's kind of, Frodo's whole point is that he's really pitiful. Like, he's not really worthy of your fear, but more you should feel really bad for him.
And I think it shows you that, like, that system is just so hostile to everyone on board that, like, when you're that person, when you're the bottom person, you will do anything to have someone beneath you. Not a healthy way to live.
Like we talked about with the Lusitania riots.
Yeah. Yeah.
You're always looking for that. What is the wedge issue that you can use to drive someone else to a lower rung?
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, like with this, Humphrey begins the story physically weak, but manages to adapt and excel in his new environment. Larsen, who fails to change, is ultimately the loser in the evolutionary struggle.
Humphrey is a zebra mussel. Just can't get rid of him.
We talk about those in class too. We're talking about invasive species. So, quoting from Link here, with Hump's ascension, Wolf simply becomes biologically unnecessary. And like the Neanderthals and Cro-Magnon men who went before him, Wolf goes metaphorically extinct at the end of the novel.
I think that's really interesting.
Aren't Cro-Magnons just like the ancestors of modern humans? I think they are. I don't think the Cro-Magnons went extinct necessarily.
I'm doing a quick Wikipedia
I think they're just an early version of Homo sapiens.
They were the first modern humans.
Okay, that's what I thought.
So they were the first. They are Homo sapiens.
Yeah, that's what I thought. But the idea holds, saying, there were these other hominids. We could say Homo erectus or something instead. But the idea that, at one point, all of those were well adapted to their environment. And at one point, they stopped being that way. And they lost out to other organisms, in this case, Homo sapiens, or, interbred with Homo sapiens. But yeah, that's how he depicts Wolf Larsen, is he's basically I don't know, it's almost like he's calling him a fossil. He's saying this is, you could have succeeded as this kind of person in a different age. Modern society demands something different.
Yeah, and I'm interested, why do they want the seals? Is it like the whale?
I think it's just their skin.
And I guess that what's interesting there is, like, I don't know how much longer really sealing goes on for, but you'd have to imagine that we're towards the tail end of that being a viable career path.
I imagine they have blubber too that they probably want.
But, like, the idea that, like, there's nowhere else for him to go. He can't go run a merchant ship because it would never fly with what he's doing. Like,
yeah, he
kind of has to exist on the peripheral of society.
There were some of those themes when I was, doing all the reading for the Essex on whaling, and how captains would, sometimes go between whaling and merchant shipping, and kind of the ups and downs of each one, of how, merchant shipping was a bit more reliable, but it didn't have a lot of the same sort of excitement. you pretty much knew what you were going to get from a merchant voyage, where like whaling had the added excitement of, you could make twice as much as you made last time, depending on how well you do.
That's sort of a plot point with the Chase character in the Heart of the Sea movie. In the beginning, his wife is like, go be a merchant captain. You'll only be gone for 3 months.
To our discussion of like physical prowess, merchant shipping doesn't really matter how good you are at it. You're getting kind of a fixed rate. You just got to get stuff from one place to another. Whereas with whaling, a successful whaler, that does say something about you as a physical specimen. If you're a good harpooner, if you're a good whaling captain, it means there's something, there's that sort of primal brutality in you that, just despite that kind of has negative connotations, but like kind of everyone wishes they had a little bit of that.
It's why Navy SEALs will always be cool, right?
Yeah, it's like
there's a cool factor associated with being part of a group like that.
Yeah, it's like wishing that you had like the physical ability and bravery to, like, come on, like hurling a harpoon into this monstrous sea beast, when you're standing like 5 feet away from it. Come on, like there's something cool about that, right?
Also, the cooler thing in the sealing is that they use shotguns.
There's that. Seems a little bit less heroic.
More fun probably, but...
And it seems like I feel like probably less of... Not to say that a seal couldn't hurt you, but I feel like it's probably not going to destroy your whole boat.
I wouldn't think. And again, you have a shotgun, so like shoot it.
Yeah, it's something that seems a little bit less...
sporting.
Less sporting about killing hunting seals. Than hunting whales. I can at least, regardless of what you think about like hunting whales, I think doing it with like, traditional equipment, harpoons and spears and stuff, there is at least something where you feel like, all right, that was kind of a fair fight, like whoever wins that battle definitely, earned it.
You're not just braining a seal with buckshot.
So the next of the 5 deaths of Wolf Larsen, death by death. One of the really fascinating characters. So even though he's, on stage for a pretty small amount of time, the character of Death Larsen, Wolf's brother, weighs really heavily on the narrative. From the very first time he's mentioned, I think first in chapter 10, we see that he's a really troubling figure for Wolf Larsen. And, this is after we've seen Wolf Larsen seem really omnipotent on this vessel. And then suddenly we see that he too is afraid of something.
Yeah, it's interesting seeing that like he's terrified of his brother.
Yeah, this is kind of there's always a bigger fish type of argument, and probably really troubling for Humphrey on some level, saying like, well, if this guy is scared of this other guy, I really never want to meet that guy. So Wolf Larsen's telling Humphrey about his brother, Death. He says, and he has never philosophized on life, I added. That's Humphrey talking. No, Wolf Larsen answered with an indescribable air of sadness. And he's all the happier for leaving life alone. He's too busy living it to think about it. My mistake was in ever opening the books.
I kind of get it, in a way. I think I say this a lot when I deal with someone who's just frustrating or living in their own world, or just like the people who think they're like way smarter than they are. I hate like being aware sometimes.
I think everyone feels that to an extent. And I think I think it's kind of that dilemma where it's not that it's hard to consider other people like sentient, but it's hard to do in the same way. Like sometimes you get so fixated on your own problems that everyone else is basically a supporting character in your, you are the protagonist of your own story, but everyone feels that way. Even someone that you're thinking, oh, this person just like floats through life. This person doesn't think about anything. This person doesn't have any sort of deep thoughts. It's like those people probably also feel the same way about everyone else.
I want to be someone who's impressed with like a morning show, like a morning wake up TV show. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I want to be like, give me the easy, like, I guess like the ability to be impressed that easily with something so like fake and artificial at this point.
To an extent with Larsen here, this idea of like, if only I wasn't such a deep thinker, if only I could stop philosophizing on life. I think that is a feeling that a lot of people have, but at the same time, I think expressing it that way, it sort of comes off in a kind of Reddit atheist way.
It definitely gives me like 14-year-old who like decided he's a libertarian.
Of like, man, everyone else just has this veil over their eyes.
Mm-hmm.
And I have this weight of existence because I'm the one who understands what life really is and what the world really looks like. And yeah, if everyone felt like I do, then, you know, everyone would be so sad and depressed. And really, that's what's holding me back from success, is that I am stuck thinking about these things. Everyone else can just mindlessly go through life and do their job and, you know, go to work and come home and just exist. But me, man, I'm burdened with the understanding of what life really is.
There is the appeal, though, of being a golden retriever person.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's plenty of times where you kind of wish for that. You wish that, man, I wish I did not care about some of these things. But like, at the same time, it's kind of in the same way that, like, you know, a kid might wish that they could have ice cream for dinner every day. I
wish that I just got super excited for The Voice, and that was what I wanted to come home and do.
Yeah, it would very quickly lose its appeal. But then again,
absolutely,
by this line of argument, like, you wouldn't know the other side of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but like you said, it quickly spirals into like Reddit atheist or like libertarian teenager territory fast.
Next section is death by capitalism.
Uh-oh.
Something that happens on our show a lot. This is the final death described in Link's piece. So here again, Death Larsen plays a role, and more specifically, his ship. Death Larsen is captain of the Macedonia, which is a steam-powered sealer, which can just easily outperform the Ghost, which also ultimately leads to his ability to poach crew members from Wolf's ship with the promise of more lucrative rewards.
Yeah, I feel like there's like a technology kind of angle here as well.
Yeah, and it's one of the first things that Wolf says about his brother is that, yeah, he's captain of the steamship Macedonia. So you have this sense that, like, well, it's like he's cheating. You know, he's got this fancy steamship.
Yeah, it's almost like Larsen has like, he does have like a personal like code of honor, even if it doesn't make sense to anyone else. Mm-hmm. Like there's rules, even if they're not clear.
I'm very interested in like folk tales and tall tales and folklore and things like that. But it's kind of interesting because it puts Wolf Larsen in the same sort of like tragically doomed position as other folktale characters. Like, I think most clearly John Henry.
Mm-hmm.
Sure, John Henry wins his personal struggle against the steam shovel, but kind of the feeling of the story is like, well, John Henry beat the steam shovel, but John Henry is like supernaturally strong.
Yeah, it sort of proves the inevitableness of the technology in a way.
Not everyone can be John Henry, so, you know, the steam shovel's going to win out. There's like similar versions of like the Paul Bunyan story where he does a competition with like an engine powered saw.
Our modern version is going to be like The Last Real Cashier. Amy Smith, the last of the cart checkers.
Yeah. We talked about Alfred Boltop's Stormalong, and there's that story where he sees a steamship and he dumps water on it because he thinks it's on fire. And, you know, he doesn't understand this new technology of having the steam engine. Wolf Larsen it's kind of almost more tragic because he knows that, like, he seems to acknowledge that, like, this is the way of the future. I'm kind of stuck here. But yeah, like you said, he has no intention of changing. You know, he's not gonna, he doesn't really express any desire to have one himself. He just kind of
loathes the existence of it. This is going to be us with like AI.
So Link's ultimate conclusion in that article: the character best suited for survival in the Seawolf is not the Superman, but the whole man. One who's adaptable, who has both moral as well as physical courage, and who's enhanced by a vital optimism and the capacity to love.
I think that's a pretty good way of just describing like the view of positive masculinity throughout this book, of like a balanced masculinity that isn't afraid of love. And I feel like it's presented very different today. When you say masculinity, that's not what you think of necessarily. But I feel like he does point out, like, you have to have both.
Yeah, you have to be able to exist in a society.
We live in a society.
We are living in a society. So some other stuff I took notes on here and kind of alluded to already was So Jack London, kind of his personal views, his political views coming through in this book. We've talked about a little bit with, evolution and natural selection. London's politics, he was a socialist. It earned him the opposition of Teddy Roosevelt.
Probably not the worst person to have write bad things about you.
Yeah. Who accused him and other nature writers of being, quote, nature fakers, who did not understand the heart of the wild things.
I love that this stuff goes on perpetually in politics, that the man who was kind of a faker in his military and nature stuff accuses other people of being fakers.
Everything is projection.
It's funny that just all of this still just happens, and it happened back in the day.
Jonathan Berliner has an article in American Literary Realism called Jack London's Socialistic Social Darwinism. It was an interesting read in regard to London's views on politics and race.
Oh, no.
So quoting from the article, from naturalistic muckraking scenes of immersion in the abyss of the slums of London, the city, I'm talking about here, to his recurrent praise of primordial supermen, London presents nature as a brutal force, but crucially, one that could be harnessed for socialistic purposes. Going back to the analysis of the death of Larsen, we could see that it's his failure to integrate with a wider society as the reason for his death. No matter how strong, how tough, how brutal he is, his refusal to be harnessed here is what leads to his pretty pathetic death.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't die in some titanic struggle going out in a blaze of glory. He withers away blind in his cabin.
Alone, basically.
So it's a very ignoble death for such a titanic figure as Wolf Larsen.
Mm-hmm.
The thing about social Darwinism, that has rightly fallen out of fashion. 100 years ago, that would have been something you could kind of discuss pretty openly, and it would have been considered on par with other ideas. And we've fortunately moved past that. But yeah, it would have been a much more mainstream idea in the early 20th century. I think what's interesting, doing some of this reading and other reading that I've done, is there's a tendency for the term social Darwinism to be thought of as a perversion of Darwin, or a misreading of Darwin, saying, well, you can't take this and put it into this context. That may be true, but Darwin himself had a pretty problematic view of things like social safety nets in his own writing, in The Descent of Man, which is not quite as famous as On the Origin of Species. In The Descent of Man, he basically takes those natural selection ideas from On the Origin of Species, and he applies them very specifically to humanity, which is a road that we kind of know that leads to eugenics.
But also, I don't think we should be surprised that he applies it that way. Why wouldn't he have applied it that way? It's on us to, separate out those things. He's a product of his time. And
you have this theory that you have found that applies to so many things in nature. Of course, you're going to apply that as broadly as possible. But yeah, just to give an idea of what I mean here, the idea of social Darwinism, it's not really a misreading of Darwin.
It's almost an over-application of Darwin.
Well, I mean, Darwin himself, so in Descent of Man, he writes, with savages, the weak in body or mind are soon eliminated, and those that survive commonly exhibit a vigorous state of health. We civilized men, on the other hand, do our utmost to check the process of elimination. We build asylums for the imbecile, the maimed, and the sick. We institute poor laws, and our medical men exert their utmost skill to save the life of everyone to the last moment. There's reason to believe that vaccination has preserved thousands who from a weak constitution would formerly have succumbed to smallpox. Thus, the weak members of civilized societies propagate their kind. No one who has attended to the breeding of domestic animals will doubt that this must be highly injurious to the race of men. It's surprising how soon a want of care, or care wrongly directed, leads to the degeneration of a domestic race. But excepting in the case of man himself, hardly anyone is so ignorant as to allow his worst animals to breed. So when I say some of these things defy our modern right-left paradigm, this man is pro-vaccine, but yeah, everything else is pretty bad. I don't think he's pro-vaccine. I thought he would be pro... No, he is. I misread that. He wants people to die from smallpox. Yeah, his point is that those people should not be in society. We're artificially keeping people in, and we wouldn't do that with animals. I bet Darwin wore glasses. I think so. I don't know.
Well, he shouldn't be writing if he can't see. So
He definitely wore clothes, which is not something that animals do in nature.
I definitely misread that. I completely read that as like a good thing. And then, he's definitely complaining about it.
I think on that note, like, it's important to note that, like, I think you see this mostly from, like, again, like I read a lot of, the Dawkins and Hitchens, and I never really liked Sam Harris. Even when I was very into that stuff, I always thought Sam Harris was a douche.
Because he is.
But all those kind of like new atheist and, modern evolutionary biology writers, there is a tendency to say, well, like, Darwin's ideas were good, but people, the Nazis, people with bad intentions misinterpreted what he was writing. That's very much not the case. Like, he
right.
He had some extremely awful views about how his ideas should be applied to humanity. I think it's important to, like, acknowledge the ideas for what they are and them being pioneering ideas, but also saying, like, yeah, this is why you don't pick one person to elevate as, this is the person, this is the chief of the pantheon, is because, like, yeah, you're always filtering through ideas. There's nothing objectively morally good or bad about the theory of natural selection, because it's an explanatory theory rather than something to aim for, which is, I think, the problem, which is where you get eugenics. And so, speaking of natural ideas, London saw the development of socialism as the result of a natural and evolutionary process, more so than a social one. So, to quote from Berliner here, for London, this valorization of the noble strong man was explicitly linked to socialism. Race doesn't play a huge role in the Seawolf, which is probably...
Yeah, it really doesn't.
Probably for the best. London, I feel like the best term for him, if I was going to describe his views on race, I guess I would call him a racialist rather than a racist. Like, they go hand in hand, obviously.
I feel like London doesn't inherently dislike other races. He just wants to sort and classify them.
There's just always is an uncomfortable fixation with categories. and
I just picture it being the same as having, like, butterflies pinned to a board. Like, he wants to, like, know each genus and, like, all this stuff.
Even if the calipers don't help you make a moral judgment about a person, the fact that you have them out is off-putting. We tend to think of racism as implicit or explicit hate for another group. Obviously, it manifests in different ways. London was much more focused on just the division and categorization into races, from which there would naturally emerge the strongest specimens. So blending those ideas with the ideas of natural selection. Like, naturally, the fittest will rise to the top. And, fully believing that every race did have their own fittest that would rise to the top. Whites, of course, would produce the greatest quantity of the best specimens. and I think where this is expressed best, London wrote in newspapers, and in the first decade of the 1900s, that meant covering boxing. London is remembered for his coverage of the Jack Johnson-James Jeffries fight in 1910. James Jeffries being labeled the Great White Hope. That is something from Jack London. This idea of the long-awaited boxer who could finally defeat Jack Johnson, who, for those unfamiliar with the history, was black. And he acted in ways, to white society that you don't associate with someone, in 1910. You think about a figure like Muhammad Ali, who talked and talked and talked, and, made a lot of people hate him that way. A lot of white America, especially. And despite, the era he was boxing in, kind of the heart of the civil rights era, you can kind of conceptualize someone acting that way, and having the attitude that he had. Whereas, like, in 1910 America, a black athlete demonstrating, bravado and, sort of mocking white America is almost inconceivable. And, this was infuriating to white America that no one could beat this guy. And so there was finally this fight between James Jeffries and Jack Johnson. London obviously wrote about it in the lead up to it, because finally this guy was supposed to be the one who could beat Jack Johnson. Realistically, that was never the case. James Jeffries was really old by this point. So yeah, there was no realistic chance, really. London predicted that Jeffries would win the fight due to his, quote, abysmal brutishness.
Interesting.
Which is a term you'd expect a white writer to be using about the black boxer at this time, probably. But Jack London is using this as a positive. He's saying this is a good thing. This is what you need to succeed. You need this brutishness for survival, kind of like what we see in Wolf Larsen. The fight itself wasn't much of a contest, leading London and other white sports writers to admit the clear superiority of Johnson as a fighter. A few years earlier, London had written about the Jack Johnson and Tommy Burns fight, saying, quote, "A white man wishes a white man to win. This should not prevent him from giving absolute credit to the best man who did win, even when that best man was black. All hail to Johnson. His victory was unqualified."
It feels a lot like me being like, I hate the Ravens, but like, gotta give it to them. They won.
That, but for your race.
Yeah.
It's treated a bit like a team sport here.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways, I think that, seeing that written in a newspaper, that racism or racialism or whatever you want to call it, it's almost more galling to a modern reader because of its openness. Saying, like, well, yeah, of course I want the white guy to win. Like, I'm a white guy. Why would I want the black guy to win?
But also, like, then also being willing to acknowledge, like, but he didn't win, and like this guy did. It's just very interesting. There's not like he cheated or he's undeserving or something. It's like, nah, he won.
Well, and then also with London and other writers reading about Jack Johnson, and there's a lot in how he's praised, and I think you see this a lot. You see this a lot in modern sports also. I think the classic one that I think fortunately has fallen out of fashion is, the NFL Combine, when guys are interviewing people, just describing a player as articulate.
Mm-hmm.
It's not something you hear white players described as. That's something you would really only hear a black player described as, with kind of the implication that, oh, wow, I'm surprised that this really good black athlete can actually talk, can actually have a conversation with me.
Right. Yeah. Right.
And so, like, with London here, you see like his very sort of black and white, I mean, unintentional pun there, depiction of like, well, of course, why would I want the black guy to win? Why would any white guy want the black guy to win? And everything is reduced to the level of race. There's no other factors, not taking into account, the fighters' personalities or, their style of fighting even.
And it's almost presented as like neutral, which is what is also weird. It's like not bad that he's black. It's just like, he is black and I am white, so I want the white guy to win. Like, it's weird. We just don't write like this anymore.
My original point with like the selection of words we use to describe people is how like Jack Johnson's victories are described. Mm-hmm. He's praised for his cunning and his craftiness in the ring, when in fact, like, he's just a better athlete than these guys that he's facing.
Mm-hmm.
Even, James Jeffries himself after the fight said, like, I could not have touched this guy on my best day in my prime.
Mm-hmm. He's just a better boxer.
Jack Johnson said that, he thought the fight was basically over in the 4th round. He lands an uppercut and he can see that James Jeffries is basically done. And it goes, I think, 14 rounds, because I think that was still back in the day when fights didn't end by decision.
Mm-hmm.
You had to either get knocked out or throw in the towel. And James Jeffries' ring threw in the towel just so he did not have a knockout on his record. But yeah, I mean, that's obviously a big tangent from the Seawolf, but I think all of that's important for understanding where a writer is coming from, is seeing what are they doing in their daily life? How is that informing their writing? And I think like Robert Evans talks about when he reads, a Ben Shapiro book, is you get a lot about what someone thinks almost more from their fiction than from their nonfiction writing. Right,
because it's like a world they're creating. They can make all the rules.
And yeah, in nonfiction, you tend to be more guarded because you're trying to control the message. Whereas like fiction, things tend to come out that maybe you didn't intend to come out. And that there's something a little bit more honest about that.
Like how all the good people in Ben Shapiro's book are tall.
A bear of a man. One other...
I'm sorry. I'm sure Yellowstone's a great show, but I just picture it basically being like the Ben Shapiro world.
Yeah, that's one of those shows that, like, I don't know anyone who watches it, but I know it's like the most popular show on TV.
I refuse. I'm not.
There was one other quote that I had just extracted here, just because I thought it was interesting. It's a quote from Maud when she's talking to Humphrey in chapter 37. She says, "When I dismantled my old pantheon and cast out Napoleon and Caesar and their fellows, I straightaway erected a new pantheon. And the first I installed was Dr. Jordan." Which is funny because in my head, I can only imagine her talking about Jordan Peterson.
Me too. That's the first thing I thought of.
But I think that quote is revealing because it's like how we interact with things.
Mm-hmm.
The sort of extreme nature of, I think this usually happens when you're younger, but you kind of grip onto things wholeheartedly,
mm-hmm.
and you dispense things wholeheartedly.
Mm-hmm.
I think, like growing up in a religious household, for example, that's the thing. And then, I don't know, whatever it is, whether it's going to college or moving overseas, whatever it might be, getting a new job, pendulum swings all the way the other direction. A kid going to university and getting into, your Dawkins, your Hitchens and everything like that.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's why Reddit atheists exists, right?
Is going to jump into that with both feet and throw out everything that they used to have.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, you do that as you're younger, and then I think as you get older, you manage to take things from different areas and realize what is important and nuanced about things. And so her even using the word pantheon, but saying, yeah, just swapping out one thing for another and saying, well, this is the new thing. This is my new idol, basically, that I'm worshiping. So I just think that's an interesting bit from Maud there. So, I mean, the end of the book we've alluded to already, but, ultimately Humphrey and Maud, they have their little, I really hate the last scene of the book. Wolf Larsen is dead. They've buried him at sea. Are they on the boat? I think they're on the boat.
I believe so.
And they see a rescue boat coming to get them. And God, I hate this so much. Humphrey says, her lips met the press of mine, and by what strange trick of the imagination I know not, the scene in the cabin of the ghost flashed upon me when she had pressed her fingers lightly on my lips and said, hush, hush. My woman, my one small woman, I said, my free hand petting her shoulder in the way all lovers know, though never learn in school. My man, she said, looking at me for an instant with tremulous lids which fluttered down and veiled her eyes as she snuggled her head against my breast with a happy little sigh. I looked toward the cutter. It was very close. A boat was being lowered. One kiss, dear love, I whispered. One kiss more before they come. And rescue us from ourselves, she completed with a most adorable smile, whimsical as I had never seen it, for it was whimsical with love. And that's how the story ends.
Yeah, didn't love it.
I really hate the ending of the story. I think
he's a better action writer than he is romance writer.
There's a lot written about like the role of love in the story and how it develops, and I think it's sort of like obviously it's a fictional story, so whatever happens is what the author wants to happen, but it's not exactly a good like experimental case, because it's like there's one woman in the story for him to fall in love with, and he does. So like it kind of makes you wonder, okay, what's their relationship like after they're back, in society? Now that Humphrey has changed into a totally different person, now he has his physical prowess in addition to his obvious like mental acumen. He's fallen in love with this woman basically out of proximity because they went through this experience together. Does that continue? Do they continue to feel the same way about each other when there are, this like, it sounds callous, but like other options on the table, like just the idea that like that's how people operate. I'm like not impressed that Humphrey managed to fall in love with like the one woman basically, in the book. In a book from this time period. So yeah, I think the love story aspect of it is a bit, I don't know, it feels almost like it's like it just has to be there because people wanted that in a book they were going to read.
I really loved the first 2/3 of this book, and the last third I wanted it to stop.
Yeah, there's a lot of good stuff in it, but there's some pieces I didn't.
I genuinely enjoyed the first 2/3. Our favorite Mexican revolutionary, Ambrose Bierce, I think he has a quote here that like pretty much
I don't think he doesn't have good things to say about this, I don't think.
His thoughts are pretty much like mine. I agree with this statement. He says, the great thing, and it's among the greatest of things, is the tremendous creation Wolf Larsen. The hewing out and setting up of such a figure is enough for a man to do in one lifetime. The love element, with its absurd suppressions and impossible proprieties is awful. I agree. That sums up my thoughts on the book.
That's really accurate. Ambrose Bierce, leave it to him.
Yeah, that's I couldn't say it better myself. It's definitely worth a read, though. I wouldn't read it again, but it was good to read.
There's a few movie versions I really want to check out.
I feel like there's a good movie element here. You could make a good movie out of this.
I kind of forgot to bring this up, but in our talk about like socialist realism, Jack London was like super popular in Soviet Union, especially like the early Soviet Union. I don't think Stalin was a big fan of his.
Stalin didn't like anything
and had his works kind of, I don't know if he like had them formally suppressed, but one of the reasons was that basically the way that Jack London's writing, whether it's explicitly political or not, blended with socialist ideas. Social development. Jack London wrote a ton about, he wrote about like the urban poor, and he wrote about, the development of society from a way that, showed that society was necessary. You needed to work together. And so he was super popular in the Soviet Union. And I forget who it was. It was a journalist or a reporter who was visiting the Russian front lines in like 1917. So like after at least the initial revolution, and he was talking to the Russian soldiers about like American culture, and like almost all of them brought up Jack London. And so he was kind of asking like, why is Jack London so popular? And they actually didn't know that Jack London was dead. He had died in 1916, I think. And so it's this journalist who has to break the news to these frontline Russian soldiers that Jack London is dead. And they basically hold an impromptu funeral / memorial service for Jack London.
Really?
And all these Russian soldiers are lining up and sharing their experiences. And, well, this is the book that I read that, changed my life, or this was my experience with Jack London. I don't know the situation. I don't know what kind of unit it was, because I would imagine a lot of frontline Russian soldiers couldn't read at the time, but they could have still been familiar with it through, recitations and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
But I thought that was interesting because like Jack London, I didn't know that about him. I didn't know that he was so massively popular in the Soviet Union, and like continues to be popular in Russia today. I think there's a Russian version of the Seawolf on film that I'd like to check out.
Yeah, I would like to check that out.
You could do a movie episode about that.
There's a 2009 miniseries version with Nev Campbell in it.
There's one that has Charles Bronson
and Christopher Reeve.
Yes. Is it from like the 90s?
I think, or maybe the 80s.
Yeah, so there's some ones that we could definitely check out if we wanted to watch the Seawolf on screen.
For sure. That was fun though. I like that. I like going through that.
I think that was a fun way to do it. So we'll have more of these book club ones. By the time you listen to this, we might have announced our next book club selection. We'll try to keep them to things that are easily accessible, ideally in the public domain, so you can access them for free somewhere. So thank you for listening. If you've, listened to all of this, and the rest of these will be up on the second mate tier on Patreon if you want to check these out. So until then, take care.
Have you heard about Jack Johnson? He's a hero in this land. I don't like to sing about boxing, but I hope